Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this London Frontline Online Power Panel of experts and journalists in Kyiv, Ukraine. My name is Michael Butsurkiw. I'm your co-moderator for this evening. I'm a global affairs analyst, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and also a regular contributor to CNN Opinion. Also a lot of experience in Ukraine, having been the former spokesperson of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission here to Ukraine. With me this evening is Olga Rudenko, PhD, literary critic, and associate professor at the Department of Literature of Kyiv Mohila Academy. She is also co-founder of Kyiv Mohila Humanities Journal and co-founder of the NGO New Ukrainian Academic Community. Welcome. So this is one of many in the World Briefing series moderated by me over the past few months, with the last one being hosted from Toronto on the World Ahead in 2020. And indeed, in that panel, there was plenty of talk about the situation here in Ukraine, but also about the United States, its current, its past status rather as the world's policeman, but also its role as guarantor of security of such hotspots as Ukraine and Taiwan, particularly after the chaotic withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan. We welcome everyone who is attending here in person at the Public Media Academy in Central Kyiv. Thank you very, very much to our host this evening, as well as the very many people joining us online from around the world. Before we get started, we'd like to remind everyone attending here this evening to silence your mobile phones, and that people here in person and online will be invited to ask questions online and in person. And also, we will be doing an introduction in Ukrainian shortly, and also a conclusion in Ukrainian, but most of the time it will be in English. And also, for those of you online, please click on the comments box and type in your questions for any of the panelists. So tonight, of course, the briefing panel, the topic is on the Ukrainian crisis, specifically, what does a Russian invasion of Ukraine look like? What are the regional and global consequences from the unnecessary suffering and economic losses it could cause? Also, what else can the West do to better prepare Ukraine for one of the most serious threats to it in modern history? We will discuss the latest developments and analyze the impact of the Western allies' diplomatic efforts to de-escalate and deter Russian ambitions. Including, of course, as part of the discussion, will be a focus on the current mood in Ukraine, as a flurry of high-level diplomatic activity reaches a peak with visits to Moscow and Kiev by leaders of France and Germany. And actually, as we speak, the British Foreign Secretary is in Moscow right now with Mr. Lavrov. We heard it's not going as well as thought, but more on that later, perhaps. Also, this week, we saw the leaders of smaller neighboring countries visit Kiev, suggesting the Zelensky administration is pursuing what I would say is a wide strategy of forming micro-alliances. And, of course, amid all of this, the presidency of Volodymyr Zelensky is under intense scrutiny as he tries to calm a nervous nation with as many as, according to Ukraine's defense minister, 140,000 Russian troops on the border. There is growing pressure on him to adhere to the conditions of the 2015 Minsk agreements, which were signed by his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko. And speaking of Mr. Poroshenko, to make this whole kind of situation even more complex and kind of surreal, is the presidential administration some weeks ago initiated legal proceedings against Mr. Poroshenko for alleged treason and supporting terrorism. And as we all know, the government, as well as the nation, is currently in a very, very difficult fight with an invisible enemy, that being the COVID-19 pandemic. The current Omicron wave continues to sicken Ukrainians and foreigners alike, including some who were meant to be here tonight, either in the audience and in person. And finally, as Mr. Putin prepared to make his next move to checkmate the West, China is looking on very, very carefully, taking lessons on how far Russia can push the West to expand its sphere of influence. And just a few days ago, of course, on the sidelines of the Beijing Olympics, the presidents of Russia and China met, and they declared that Beijing stands with Russia against Ukraine joining NATO. And also the two declared, again, almost a surreal no-limits partnership backing each other over standoffs on Ukraine and Taiwan with a promise to collaborate more against the West. Оля?
Дякую, Михайле. Вітаємо всіх у Києві на міжнародному обговоренні новин що довкола України та російської загрози масштабного подальшого вторгнення. Сьогодні учасниками нашої зустрічі є журналісти, аналітики, письменники. Цю подію організовує London Frontline Online, і вона є однією із низки міжнародних подій з актуальних тем від проблем навколишнього середовища і науки до освіти і культури. Готує ці зустрічі Пранвера Сміт, директорка та засновниця The Frontline Club Лондон. Ця подія також є однією з багатьох у міжнародній серії, проведених журналістом Михайлом Боцюрківим протягом останніх кількох місяців. І сьогодні Михайло Боцюрків з нами вестиме цю розмову. Його голос є впізнаваних на багатьох міжнародних телевізійних каналах. Коментарі Михайла регулярно з'являються на CNN Opinion. Він є засновником і ведучим подкасту Global Impact, а також автором книжки «Цифрова пандемія», яка, сподіваємося, скоро буде перекладена на українську мову. Мене звати Ольга Полюхович, я докторка філософії в галузі літератури, літературознавиця, і сьогодні я буду співведучою. Ми вітаємо гостей в студії хабу Академії суспільного мовлення у центрі Києва на Хрещатику 26, а також усіх глядачів, які сьогодні з нами онлайн. Наш захід триватиме орієнтовно 1,5 години. За годину ми матимемо час для ваших питань. Ви можете задати їх або наживо, або онлайн через поле для коментарів. Ми їх озвучимо. Мова заходу буде здебільшого англійська, але якщо ви поставите своє питання українською, ми радо перекладемо його. Звичайно, тема сьогоднішньої розмови стосується потенційного масштабного подальшого російського вторгнення в Україну. Зокрема, ми обговоримо останні події та проаналізуємо вплив дипломатичних зусиль західних союзників України щодо деескалації та стримування російських амбіцій. Обговоримо також настрої і прогнози в Україні. У той час, коли світ пильно спостерігає за президентством Володимира Зеленського, сам лідер намагається заспокоїти своїх, м'яко кажучи, збентежених громадян, які спостерігають за ситуацією з понад 140 тисячами російських військових на її пошматованих з 2014 року східних кордонах і з боку анексованого Криму. При цьому він має справу з політичною спадщиною свого попередника Петра Порошенка щодо Мінських угод. Проти ж самого Порошенка всередині країни ведуться судові процеси за нібито державну зраду і підтримку тероризму. Україна перебуває зараз в центрі світової дипломатії. До неї приїжджають лідери як великих країн, так і менших, які припускають, мається на увазі менших, що Зеленський формує мікроальянси. Окрім зовнішніх і внутрішніх політичних змагань, Україна також бореться з менш видимим, хоча доволі відчутним ворогом – пандемією коронавірусу, нова хвиля якої вражає як українців, так і іноземців, які тут знаходяться. І нарешті, що чекати від Владимира Путіна, яким буде його наступний крок, якою буде його відповідь на зусилля західних союзників України. Як далеко він може піти, щоб розширити сферу російського впливу? Тим часом, кілька днів тому в кулуарах Олімпійських ігор у Пекіні президенти Росії і Китаю оголосили про партнерство без кордонів. І підтримали одне одного в протистоянні щодо України і Тайваню, обіцяючи ще більше і тісніше співпрацювати одне з одним. Пекін заявив, що виступає разом з Росією проти вступу України в НАТО. І багато інших новин. Ми бачимо, наскільки є динамічною ситуація, включно з останніми повідомленнями щодо перекриття Росією частин Чорного і Азовського морів для нібито навчання, а також спільних навчань російських і білоруських військових. Сподіваюся, ці теми і не тільки ці ми сьогодні і обговоримо.
So thank you. So tonight we're privileged to have panelists both in person and online. Thank you to all of you for giving your precious time, especially during this very, very difficult, busy time for you. Quick introduction of our esteemed panelists. So first, joining us online from Tbilisi, Georgia, we have Natalia Antelava, who's co-founder and editor-in-chief of Coda Story. She's an ex-BBC resident correspondent who's covered the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, the war in eastern Ukraine. Her investigations into human rights abuses in Central Asia, Iraq, and the United States have won her a number of, I should say, very, very well-deserved awards and an Emmy nomination, and strongly encourage you to check out Coda's story. Also from Kyiv, Ukraine, we have Patrick Reevell, Moscow correspondent for the U.S. network ABC News. He has covered Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia since 2012, reporting on many of the key events in the region during this period, from Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014 to the mass protests in Belarus in 2020. He has worked extensively in Ukraine since 2014. And of course, here with us tonight, we have Andrey Kurkov, welcome, Ukrainian novelist and independent thinker who writes in Russian and Ukrainian languages. He is the author of no less than 19 novels, including the bestselling Death and the Penguin. Mr. Kurkov is also president of the Ukrainian Pen Club. Frank Langfit, welcome, who flew in last night, and he's NPR's London correspondent, covering stories in the United Kingdom and Europe. Previously, he was based in Shanghai, Nairobi, Beijing, and Washington, and is author of Shanghai Free Taxi, Journeys with the Hustlers and Rebels of the New China. Highly recommend that book. And last but not least, next to me is Olga Rudenko, editor-in-chief of the Kyiv Independent, the newly launched independent English language newspaper. Previously, she was deputy chief editor of the Kyiv Post. Olga, welcome and congratulations for the initiative of the Kyiv Independent.
Дякую, Михайле. Отже, сьогодні ми раді вітати журналістів, письменників, наших експертів, які приєдналися до нас як у київській студії, так і онлайн. Дякуємо, що ви з нами. І з Тбілісі онлайн з нами сьогодні Наталія Antelava, співзасновниця та головна редакторка онлайн-платформи Coda Story. Працювала кореспонденткою BBC, висвітлювала вторгнення Росії в Грузії у 2008 році, а також російсько-українську війну на сході України. Її журналістські розслідування про порушення прав людини в країнах Центральної Азії, Іраку, Сполучених Штатах принесли їй низку нагород, у тому числі номінацію на Еммі. З Києва з нами онлайн сьогодні також Патрік Reevell, московський кореспондент каналу US Network ABC News. З 2012 року він працював над новинами у країнах Східної Європи, Центральної Азії та Росії, зокрема, і висвітлював ключові події за цей період. Від анексії Криму Росією в 2014 році до масових протестів у Білорусі у 2020 році. Він багато працював в Україні з 2014 року. І в студії сьогодні з нами Андрій Курков, український письменник та журналіст, який пише українською та російською мовами. Він автор 19 романів, включно із бестселером «Пікнік на кризі» та останнім, якщо я не помиляюся, «Сірі бджоли», який перекладений на низку інших мов. Андрій Курков є президентом української пен-організації. Наступний наш гість – це Френк Ленгфіт, лондонський кореспондент NPR, який висвітлює новини у Великобританії та інших країнах Європи. Раніше він працював у Шанхаї, Найробі, Пекіні, Вашингтоні. Френк є автором книжки «Шанхайське безкоштовне таксі. Подорожі з волоцюгами та бунтівниками Нового Китаю». І з нами сьогодні Ольга Руденко, головна редакторка The Kyiv Independent, щойно заснованого англомовного видання у Києві. І раніше Ольга працювала заступницею головного редактора Kyiv Post. Вітаємо всіх і дуже дякуємо, що ви долучилися сьогодні.
Thank you, Olga. So from here on, we'll be going straight into English, and then at the end, we'll have a very brief bilingual wrap-up. So let's go first, if we can, to Tbilisi, Georgia, where Natalia Antelava is waiting with us. Natalia, thank you very much for joining us. In a recent Coda article, you posed the question, in the case of Ukraine, how do we show the correlation between the lies broadcast on TV and the battle unfolding on the ground? Balanced reporting is no longer enough to cover the murky, slippery subject of disinformation. Can you elaborate on that? And can you briefly answer, how should the Western media be covering the current crisis amid this information war waged by both sides? And remember, too, that we have not only cutbacks, but also restrictions put on by the COVID pandemic. It's a tough job to be a reporter, it sounds like, these days. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I'm obviously heartbroken that I'm not there in person. I would, very much would like to be in Kiev right now. But thanks for the question, Michael. I do think that reporting on lies in general is one of the greatest challenges that journalists face, and we've learned, I think, a great deal as an industry. I think we've learned a great deal since the early kind of spikes in disinformation campaigns, and it was definitely, for me, it was incredible to witness the disinformation onslaught during the annexation of Crimea and the subsequent war in the Donbass, and realize how the disconnect both between realize how kind of ignoring the parallel reality that was happening on TV and meant that we were ignoring how that violence, that was made up violence that was happening on TV, was kind of on Russian television in that case, was sliding into into the real world. And we went from pretty much peaceful demonstrations in Donetsk to sunflower fields full of bodies and the MH17 plane. So and I think journalists, we are tribal people, and we tend to gather around the narratives that we pick or others pick, and we sort of follow the same way that we tend to group together in bars and so on. And as a result, we often come out with a very with a narrative that doesn't have all the nuance and that the stories that we cover deserve. This is absolutely not to say, and that currently, I think plenty of journalists are doing an extraordinary job with covering the crisis in Ukraine, but the difficulty, of digging deeper into the narratives. And for example, I'll give you an example. One thing that I'm noticing right now is, it is very much being the crisis is very much being framed as the crisis between Russia and the United States in the media. There is very little room for like a more intricate discussion on, well, what is, but what does NATO mean to Ukraine or the Baltics, right? And that allows, and that links exactly back to disinformation, because it allows, allows those who set the narratives, because that's exactly the narrative that Russia is trying to set, to be repeated again and again. I think the second part of your question, one thing I wanted to comment on was the balance issue. I do think that balance is one of the greatest things that came out of sort of Western school of journalism, and I'm absolutely not. I think it's hugely important for the media to be balanced. But I think in the time of this information overload that we live in, the quest for balance often ends up with being sort of he said, she said situation, where we need to put both sides on and present both arguments just because, but just because we say that's the balance. In Crimea, the little green man with Putin's NATO argument, it's another example of where, for balance, we have to say, well, this is what Putin fears. And that's the argument that he is presenting. And I think the lesson here is that we really need to, the reporters really need to focus on the ground and focus on getting away from that one bar where everyone is crowding in and looking at sort of the root causes of the conflicts that we cover, and looking at the context and, not just repeating sort of little green men, but actually looking for actual people behind the stories. And I think many journalists are definitely doing that, but I think that's the best kind of antidote to the information overload that generates this disinformation, because it's not just fake news anymore. I think fake news is sometimes the least of the problem. It's the fake narratives that have been constructed and are being constructed that journalists somehow needs to puncture through.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Natalia. Olga, over to you.
Okay, thank you. We are continuing our discussion on different narratives, and narratives is not only field for journalists, but for writers too. And my next question goes to Andrey Kurkov. The pretext is that these days I've received letters from my colleagues and friends overseas asking how we live here under this huge stress, threats and pressure. So how things are in Kiev, and Andrey Kurkov published a column on this topic in The Grid, I guess, and as a writer, of course, he can comment and tell more. He feels the atmosphere more deeper and can present the whole narrative. So, Andrey, how people in Kyiv behave themselves in all this like a clash of terrible news?
Well, actually, I live between the village in Coda region and Kyiv, trying to compare the situations in both places. And I should say that actually both places are... sorry, I'll restart. I live between actually Zhytomyr region, a house in the village, and central part of Kyiv, just 10 minutes away from here. And I am trying to compare what is happening in both places, and I should say that actually both places are living their ordinary lives. I mean, Kyiv is quiet, people are not panicking, the food is there in the shops. What I was surprised to find out that actually tickets to the theaters are sold out very often, and people actually, like in 2014, it's very difficult to buy tickets for certain performances. I didn't check the Russian drama theater, but I checked Theater on Podil and Ivano-Franka. What is interesting actually that also people are very quiet and saying that we are for 8 years in war with Russia. So I mean, this is not very different from what we had. And the other thing is that actually now, since there is a law about territorial defense, many people quietly just join these courses. And I have several friends who are joining the courses of medical emergency, medical aid, and actually territorial army training. Actually, yesterday a friend of mine, a former journalist, joined the courses in regional territorial defense, and he's going to have training in Gostomel, which is about 20-25 kilometers away from Kyiv. So I think there is a competition between city territorial defense and regional one. The other thing I loved, that some of my friends decided to attend sommelier courses at the same time, and 2 of them already passed the exams. So I mean, there is a certain spirit of, I think, Widerstand in German, sort of resistance, and an attempt to do more than usual to fill your life with more events and with more activities. So I mean, this is my impression. But I was also on the phone with people in Mariupol, and they say also it's very quiet. The cafes are full. People are just working, earning money, making plans for the summer. I think it's very important actually for Ukrainians to make plans for the summer, because I mean, winter holidays in Egypt and Dominican Republic are over. People are coming back now from there.
Thank you. Okay, making plans for summer. That's a fantastic segue for a question to Olga Rudenko about Mr. Zelensky. I think a few weeks ago, didn't he say that Ukrainians should get ready for barbecuing season and all that? And by the way, the sommelier classes sound very interesting. I might sign up, but I see another past member of Ukrainian Boy Scouts here. At least we know how to light a bonfire real good, don't we? So, Olga Rudenko, Kyiv Independent. I actually spent the whole day today writing a piece for CNN Opinion. Had a lot of fun about Mr. Zelensky, about his path from going from a comedian to a wartime president. That's a serious path. I wanted to ask you, how do you think he's coping? I've been watching a lot of Ukrainian talk shows. They go on till 3 and 4 in the morning. It's great for jet lag. But there is concern, I got to say, about his administration so far. And one last thing before you answer, there was a poll recently, I think over 50% of Ukrainians, I think in your newspaper might have been, said that they wouldn't trust Mr. Zelensky if Ukraine were attacked.
Something like 60%.
Okay. Good.
I think this was on, right? Okay. So, yeah, I was actually going to bring up that poll. I think everybody's citing it now because, yes, 60%, I think 60% of Ukrainians say that they do not trust Zelensky to be effective as a military time leader. I think in that regard, both Zelensky and his administration are paying the price for the mistakes they've made in the past couple of years. I think if the invasion happened in 2019, like a couple months after he was elected president, when his trust level was very high, it would have been a different story. But we've unfortunately seen him fail to keep some of his promises, being tolerant to corruption reports in his close circle and so on, and that undermines the trust in him, and he's paying the price for that when a poll like that comes out and it turns out that people do not believe that he can be an effective military leader. And well, I think I do agree with something that you said earlier, Michael, about him being successful in forming micro-alliances. And I know that although it is very, very popular to criticize Zelensky, but in the community of diplomats and analysts, a lot of people are saying that there are certain things that he's doing pretty smartly right now. At the same time, from the communication point of view, as a Ukrainian, I mean, not even as a journalist, but as a Ukrainian, I think he's failing me personally in communication point of view, because the famous video address that he published in January, that you just brought up, saying that Ukrainians are going to be doing shashlik and barbecue very soon, and everything's going to be great, and then comes the new year and they will tell you, I told you so, you shouldn't panic. That I think that was completely tone deaf to the situation. It did not come across right at all. It was done in a very patronizing tone, and also there was a lot of inconsistency there, because the thing was published, I think, on Wednesday. Overnight, Wednesday to Thursday, President Biden says that the invasion is imminent, and also says that a minor incursion, the infamous minor incursion comment that provoked a lot of debate. And it was such a U-turn for somebody watching it from Ukraine. Zelensky says that everything's going to be all right, but Biden says that we're basically going to be invaded. And to top that, the next day, an interview with Zelensky comes out in, I think, the Washington Post, where he says that Kharkiv might be invaded. And, for Ukrainians, that was a crazy week, because we didn't know what to believe and we were hearing so many different things. And I think the position of President Zelensky was very weak at that moment. I mean, from the communication point of view. I want to believe, I hope that behind the scenes he's much more successful in doing everything that needs to be done in terms of trying to make sure that the attack does not happen. But it is hard to keep to that hope when he's failing like that in the communication sphere. And I think, with Zelensky, we kind of tend to to keep him up to higher standards. We have a high bar for him because he comes from communications, he comes from show business. He's an actor by profession. And people tend to forget that, but he actually was a media manager. He ran one of the country's main TV channels for a couple of years. And so we kind of expect him to know what to say and how to say it and to be very effective and careful. And that's the opposite of what we're getting most of the time. So, that also comes as, I think people are expecting a lot from him, and he's not really delivering in terms of communications. Yes, at the same time, there was an famous press conference that he gave a couple of weeks ago for foreign journalists, where he said some things like, basically he was blaming the West for instigating this panic, and it irritated the whole Facebook and Twitter bubble in Ukraine very much. From what I understand, it was not perceived, it was not as irritating and as annoying to the audience in the West. It did not really bother a lot of people there. And from what I hear from people in the diplomatic circles is that while there is sometimes some irritation and frustration with his actions, in general they understand his motives. They understand that he's trying to keep the panic under control and to help the economy a little bit. So I think in general they're being forgiven.
And just quickly, the other day, he gave a Steve Jobs-like press conference or show where he promised free smartphones to pensioners and also discounted internet rates. Espresso TV had a live poll, and most people said this looks like a little bit of an election ploy to us. Just quickly, did that have any impact on you?
Did that have? I mean, I don't qualify for that.
No, of course not. But in terms of making you more impressed with his during a possible war, handing out.
I mean, no, it did not come across very well. I think. It does come across, as you said, as a bit of an election ploy. Not sure. It makes any sense. I don't think that the pensioners, that's really what they need. I mean, the pensions in Ukraine are incredibly small. They are still the lowest in Europe by far compared to other countries. And, with most of our pensioners being on this, in the survival mode the whole time, unless their children and grandchildren are helping them, I don't think that they care very much about smartphone.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for that. Frank Langford, welcome to Ukraine. You're just off the plane from London, so we'll turn to you to give us kind of view from London and overseas on all of this diplomatic activity. I can't imagine the frequent flyer miles that are being racked up by some of these diplomats, but just today we had the UK foreign minister in Moscow meeting with Mr. Lavrov. I heard it didn't go too well, but kind of what do you think all of this heightened diplomatic activity is making a big difference in terms of averting war, in terms of kind of bringing some sense into Mr. Putin's head?
It doesn't seem to at all. Today there was a lot of, I think it was a kind of a theatrical clash that to some degree was reminiscent of the Cold War in terms of the language between Liz Truss, the foreign secretary, and Lavrov. And so I don't think it tends to be, particularly with the British and the Russians right now. I don't think it seems to be going anywhere. I mean, the other thing is the position of the Americans and I think the British as well is we're happy to talk about some things that are not at the top of your list, but we want to see unilateral de-escalation. And that seems to be the sticking point right now. I think to also come back to what Andrey was saying earlier, what's been interesting is that the most sober and most concerning tone comes out of Washington and comes out of Westminster in London. And I've been trying to probe that because there's this remarkable difference between the perceptions many time zones away and here. And what's not clear to me, and I've been asking about this, is do the Brits and the Americans know something that a lot of other people don't? They have the Five Eyes. They're very effective in that way. And so I've actually asked probing questions regarding the Pentagon. And the answers I'm getting is it is more, at least from top people, a gut reaction. They are seeing troop movements unlike they've ever seen before. And of course, that can be a part of hybrid warfare, as we all know, to put on absolute top psychological pressure on the society and get it to crack in some way. But I think that in Britain and in the United States, they see this as potentially, I mean, that he would be ready to make a sizable invasion at any moment. And I continue to get that message from the US. Certainly it's what you hear, and from Britain. And so what's hard to tell is this simply them looking at a map and saying, how else do we explain all the money and material that's been moved? Or do they actually know something? And that's, I think, a big, big question. And I think we will probably find out in the coming weeks what the answer is.
And just quickly, the amount of armaments and money coming into Ukraine is actually absolutely mind-boggling. Are you hearing any concerns in the corridors of power rather, about this coming in all at once, about kind of Ukraine's absorptive capacity to use all of this stuff wisely?
I don't know about that. I know that on a daily basis, weapons are coming into the airport. How well trained are people to deal with that? And it's been going on in the case of the United States. They've just in the last year, it's been $650 million in a variety of weapons, including Javelin missiles. But exactly whether all that training between 2014 today, how much that's paid off, many people say that the Ukrainian army is much better, but there seems to be a general sense that it would not be a match for a major invasion.
Thank you. We'd like now to go back to our online panelist, Patrick Reevell. Are you there with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, hi Patrick. Thank you very, very much for joining us. You, of course, are based in Moscow most of the time. Hi there. And by the way, we hope you're feeling better. A lot of talk about Mr. Putin himself. Does he even know what he wants to do? Has the threat of historic, biting, crippling sanctions made any difference in terms of deterring him? Or do you think that Russia is already heavily sanctioned, it's kind of inoculated itself, it's getting into a tighter embrace with China? Where do we stand with Mr. Putin, do you reckon?
I apologize, I hope you can hear me. I think my internet has just become unstable, which is unfortunate given I just up the road from you guys, just isolating, unfortunately. But, as you say, one of the things I think that has been remarkable about this crisis is that people who've studied Russia for a long time are really struggling to say what it is that Vladimir Putin wants and what he's trying to get and what he's doing right now. And I think ultimately with Putin, you always have to think that there is a strong element, always it's a safe bet that there is an element of deception and of bluffing. And I think that's one of the questions that's been going on throughout. Is this going to prove to be a bluff? I think people have become more and more alarmed that it might not be, simply because of the sheer number of forces that have been moving up. At the same time, ultimately, we still don't know if what we're seeing are preparations for an invasion, or if he will go through with it. Will he be deterred? And I think one of the things I want to go back to is that the other panelists have been bringing up is here in Ukraine, there's this very strange disconnect that we're finding between what we're hearing from Washington and then what we're finding on the ground. And I think that's the first thing that foreign reporters arrive, particularly ones from the US, is this stark difference in mood. And, on the one hand, one theory is, of course, that the Ukrainian government are simply trying not to spread panic. But on the other hand, what we hear also from some analysts is that ultimately some of the things we've been hearing from the US are getting ahead of themselves to a certain degree. That when we've been hearing that an invasion was imminent, for many weeks, that was not actually the case based on what we were hearing from independent analysts, and meaning that while the Russians were certainly moving huge numbers of forces, they weren't ready to attack yet. They were moving them into place, but they weren't yet in a position to launch an attack. And we were hearing that from Ukrainian officials and also independent analysts. And, one of the questions is, what's our role as the media? We were at one point, I think, American media were pretty unpopular among Ukrainian officials for seeming to spread panic, because we were basically saying what we were hearing from the US side, which of course, we do have to report what we hear. But on the other hand, of course, we don't want to be spreading panic. And so there's this, we want to be reporting accurately. And ultimately, we're relying very much on something that is coming from satellite imagery, is coming from military analysts giving their interpretation of what we're seeing. And so I think this is one of the big challenges we're finding, is navigating these narratives and trying to, trying to explain simply and clearly what we know and what we don't know.
Great, thank you very much, Patrick. Olga?
Thank you so much, Patrick. And our next question is for Natalia Antelava. Natalia, we hope you can hear us now. This question is very close to the topic which was raised by Patrick of hybrid war, which includes enormous psychological pressure and including cyber attacks, for example, which took place in Ukraine in January. And I would like, as far as I know, you did much work on Crimea topic, and I would like to ask you, what is the rhetoric around Crimea right now? Are there any propaganda? Can you bring us some examples, probably, of propaganda messages in media? And I wonder, did the rhetoric change since 2014? Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. I think I think it's an interesting question, and I think the interesting part of the answer is that there is no rhetoric around Crimea right now, because the Crimea is not the narrative right now at all. I know that you might mean what is the Russian rhetoric around Crimea, but there is not all that much Russian rhetoric about Crimea. No one remembers Crimea. No one remembers Georgia either, in 2008. I mean, it was incredible. Just the other day, I drove up to the occupation line, which is an hour away from my house, and I stood in this village with this man from this village, and we watched together as 4 FSB officers with a big German shepherd walked around putting a new white ribbon, cutting into the churchyard of their village. And this is where the fence will be moved to, the fence that separates Russia from, well, South Ossetia, but effectively Russia from Georgia. But everyone's forgotten that this fence has been moving in more and more every year in this what is called now the creeping occupation. No one talks about these things anymore, because we're all so busy trying to guess whether Putin invades or not. I think that's just, and I agree with Patrick, we absolutely have to report on what it is that politicians say, because that's part of our job. But I think reporting on what politicians say today is fundamentally different from reporting on what the politicians were saying in even 10 years ago. Because right now, I mean, first of all, there's a noise that's created by the 24-hour news cycle, because news doesn't happen 24 hours a day. That is a lie. So to fill 24 hours with news, you really have to come up with some noise to put it in, right? And then, of course, added to that is all the social media and all of that. So, suddenly, what politicians say quickly becomes the only thing that we're reporting about, because that becomes the overwhelming narrative. And again, I by no means want to have, there's been some great journalism on Ukraine, but the majority, the narrative is very much set by, this certain things that are being kind of repeated again and again. And because they're amplified on so many platforms by so many people now, in my view, this noise has just become the new censorship. So the answer to your question is not what it is that they're saying about Crimea, but the problem that they're saying nothing about Crimea, because we've forgotten about that, as we've forgotten about Georgia, and we've forgotten about so many other things. That I think is an issue.
Thank you so much, Natalia, because we've discussed, like Andrey Kurkov mentioned already, we have the same situation in literature, like Crimea is not in the center of contemporary Ukrainian literature, but on the other hand, we have many narratives in literature on Donbass and regarding Russian-Ukrainian war, like in the novels of Artem Chekh, Sergei Zhedan, and Andrey Kurkov himself. So, Andrey, if you can comment on this a little bit. And the second question is, what is the role of intellectual in today's situation? Do you feel any changes in comparison to 2014 when we have pretty much a similar situation? Thank you.
Well, I think I'll start from afar because, I mean, if we are talking about Ukrainian literature, first of all, we should understand that Ukrainian literature until 2004 was contemporary, written by young girls and boys about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, because this literature didn't exist in the Soviet time. And then after the Orange Revolution, I should say that drugs and rock and roll were dropped from the literature. Sex was still there. Last year, I think the first time in the recent 10 years, there was no prize given to the worst description of sex in Ukrainian literature. So now sex is gone also. But the literature became much more militant, much more aggressive in a way, and much more politically engaged. And from 2014, I think there are about 300 books written about the war in Donbass, and actually the books are about the soldiers and the enemies, about the heroes and anti-heroes. So, I mean, there is not much about civil population, about civilians who live there, not about refugees. But at the same time, we have a new parallel literature after 2014, books written by war veterans. And there are hundreds probably of these diaries and memoirs and fiction books. And some of the writers who write, like Valery Marcus, who wrote his first book and sold it on social nets, 35,000 copies to other veterans. So, I mean, these writers who are veterans, I mean, they don't care about the official Ukrainian literature. They don't have any respect for writers who want to be professional writers. So there is a clash, and there are sometimes loud scandals on Facebook where they curse each other. But in fact, yeah, I mean, the writers are ready to write about Donbass, but they are not ready to write about Crimea. Crimea is gone. There are only 2 non-fiction books about Crimea after the annexation. And 1/3 of my novel, Grey Bees, also is about annexed Crimea and life of Crimean Tatars there. But generally, I mean, it looks like this lack of interest is means actually also lack of faith that Crimea can come back. But probably there might be another reason also, because before the annexation, there were no books about Crimea in Ukrainian literature. So I mean, I don't know why. And the other thing is that we don't know much about Crimean Tatar literature, because this literature was in existence from the time the Crimean Tatars came back to Crimea in 1990, but it was not translated neither in Russian nor in Ukrainian. And only now there is some support for Crimean Tatar language literature, and there is a competition for the books and novels and poetry about Crimea and written by Crimean Tatars. So, I mean, this literature should be rediscovered, and then maybe we will get novels written about life in Crimea after annexation and written by Crimean Tatar writers who are either still in Crimea or are already here in Kiev or Lviv.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrey. And Lesia Ukrainka probably would agree with us, because she wrote in her short story Nad Morem, Above the Sea, that she used to go to Crimea because of health issues, and she observed there are no Ukrainians there, just Russians, and it's the beginning of the 20th century, the beginning. So it's like very hot topic. But the next question goes to Olga Rudenko, and preceding our intellectual topics, I would like to ask you what I've observed. The Kyiv Independent co-ed columns from the Western media. I mean, like Anne Applebaum's column published in The Atlantic was published in the Kyiv Independent, and the same Stanislav Aseyev's from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So is it the part of your policy? Do you believe these columns, they are written in like, you know, maybe how to call it, elite, some on the higher level than the average perception presumes. So do you feel these columns are effective? Maybe you can provide us with the reactions of your readers, like in the combating of propaganda issues which we discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. I will go to the op-eds in a minute, but I just wanted to counter what you said. You quoted Lisa Ukrinka saying that she saw Crimea as Russian. In fact, Vladimir Nabokov, the Russian writer, at the same time, the beginning of 20th century, wrote that when he traveled to Crimea, he found it not Russian at all. The quote is, nothing Russian on the peninsula, meaning that the culture and everything he saw was Crimean Tatar. So just a little but important remark. Yeah, so we do publish and republish a lot of opinions, op-eds on our website, and they do add a certain level of certain volume and sometimes credibility to you know, the general you know, everything that we write. But the thing with op-eds is that they're tricky. On the one hand, you want to have them because they bring something important to the table, and they do give you the voices of actual people, and you know, for readers it is important. They sometimes believe something that is written, you know, with as an opinion more than they would believe, more than they would relate to a traditional article. At the same time, I think any editor of any publication right now knows that the demand for content about Ukraine is so high that you are tempted to set the bar for opinions very low and to accept just anything that comes your way, just to keep feeding the readers, you know, Ukraine content. And it is much easier to publish an opinion piece that is submitted to you than to actually send the reporter, you know, do their job and pay him to do that. And then edit it. It's a laborious process. While, you know, when somebody submits an opinion piece, it is much cheaper and faster content to produce. So I think editors everywhere are tempted to accept op-eds about Ukraine, but the danger there is that because the demand for this content is so high, and people in general want to submit opinions to the media, and people want naturally to comment on things. Very often, opinions that we see published about the issue, both in Ukrainian publications and abroad, they come from people who do not have any level of expertise about Ukraine or about war, about Putin. You know, you mentioned Stanislav Aseyev's piece that we republished. He wrote it for Radio Liberty, the Ukrainian website, and we translated it and republished with permission. So this was the kind of op-ed that is important to bring to the international audience, because you know, he was writing about the war, but he's not just a journalist and a writer. He's also a former political prisoner who spent a long time being the prisoner of Russia-backed militants in the Donbass, and this is somebody whose background justifies what he's writing about. At the same time, you know, just yesterday I I got an opinion submitted to me that I decided not to publish, which was by an active blogger living in Kiev, and he wrote the piece that was titled "Why Russian Tanks Will Not Roll into Kiev," and I mean, I can't take responsibilities saying, putting that headline on my website, but from somebody who is not an established military or foreign policy analyst. But I think the temptation to do so is pretty big, because I know people are going to click on that. So yes, I think that's something that is really hurting the quality of what is said about the crisis right now. And also in Ukraine right now, if you're a Ukrainian who tweets in English and you have at least a couple hundred followers, just be sure that you're going to be reached out to by international media to comment on Ukraine affairs and on the probability of the invasion possibly too. It is so easy to become an analyst right now, thanks to Twitter. Yeah, that the bar and the quality is very low. And earlier Michael asked Frank a question about whether Ukraine has capacity to absorb all the defense aid that it gets. And Frank said, I don't know about that. And I thought, wow, this is so refreshing. This is so refreshing for somebody to actually say that. I think people should, say I don't know more often. And, we're going to be a better world.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. I've never been complimented before for my ignorance, but I really appreciate it. I think one of the things we're talking about here, which I think is very important, is how do you make sense of something that is designed so that you can't make sense of it? We know that much. And I think the best answer is what we do. We're not opinion reporters. We come, we talk to the best, and believe me, afterwards I will be hitting you up for analysts, people that you think would be really good for us to talk to, and you can give us like vetted people. But it's really to go out in the field to talk to regular people, talk to analysts, and really look at observable fact and tell these stories. These are not stories that get lots of, traction, but they're real journalism, and they're very important. And I think that for us, what we do at NPR is we try to tell the big story through individual people with that kind of context. And, our reporters have been coming in here sort of saying, he seems great to me, this is a wonderful town, and there's this, tremendous contrast. And so we've been also trying to tell that to the American audience, that there's a big discrepancy between what you're hearing in the Pentagon and what you're hearing in London versus what is happening here on the ground. So thanks.
Thank you for that. If we can go quickly, we'll open the floor to questions very quickly. Go back to Patrick, who's up the road from us in what looks like a hotel room. Patrick, can you hear us? Maybe we'll...
in this hotel, day 4 now.
There you go, Patrick. Patrick, I've got a lot of questions. I've seen it quoted a lot in the media about Fiona Hill's op-ed, I believe it was in the Washington Post, about what's Mr. Putin's approach going to be when it comes to Ukraine. Her theory was that he will revert to his old playbook of chip away slowly and consistently, wear things down, distraction, put a fog in there, keep a hybrid war going. Do you think that's a pretty plausible argument? I only asked that because it prompted a lot of discussion on what his road ahead will be.
Yeah, certainly. I think most people would agree that that is one of the more plausible scenarios, and that ultimately what we're looking at right now is part of a very long strategy that we've been seeing for years, and that is likely to continue, which is where Putin is essentially not going to give up trying to regain control of Ukraine. And certainly I think until a few months ago, almost all of us would have said the most likely scenario is that Putin will try to do that through pressure and through subterfuge, and not through a full-scale invasion where he tries to march on the capital. And I think most people still see that as the more likely scenario. And I think one of the challenges, one of the interesting things about this crisis is that the narrative that it could be a full-scale invasion is really coming very much from the West. It's coming very much from particularly the US. At the same time, it's not, of course, entirely from the US. It's coming also from independent analysts, who are seeing this massive buildup, and there is a massive buildup. There's no question. But one of the challenges we're facing is that we also seem to be dealing with a deliberate strategy on the part of the US that sees this buildup and appears to have decided that the way to try and head off this buildup is by being very aggressive in its rhetoric and calling out Russia ahead of time and saying, we see what you're doing, we're very concerned. Also doing it in order to unite Western countries around the US so that there is a united response. And I think, that doesn't mean the US isn't genuinely concerned, but they've said it outright that their strategy right now is it's better to be trying to get ahead of Russia, including, accusing Russia of staging false flag operations, for example, announcing possible plots and disinformation schemes ahead of time. But there's a big problem for that for journalists, because when you have the US say, okay, they're going to do a false flag operation, we have intelligence, trust us, of course, it's not the journalist's job to say, well, okay, we trust you, even though we know, of course, that Russia does many false flag operations and has done it for years. It's part of the playbook. It's almost certain they are planning or have such plans to hand for Donbass. But it's very difficult for us to just say, okay, well, you said it. And I don't know if people saw this sort of testy exchange between the State Department spokesman and an AP journalist. And so that's one of the challenges that we're definitely facing. I think in terms of right now, I think the next week is actually going to be pretty crucial in telling us if this crisis is going to escalate and we're going to see the sort of nightmare scenario that we're hearing, because people know, I'm sure, there's this huge exercise going on up in Belarus right now. And on the one hand, we're hearing that, this is a potential cover for preparations for an attack. But on the other hand, we journalists know that, dozens of us have been invited to go to Belarus next week to cover these drills by the Belarusians. And I think most of us would agree that it doesn't seem plausible that they'll launch an attack while we're there, having been invited. I mean, never say never, but it just doesn't seem that plausible. So I think these exercises are due to end on the 20th of February. And so I think, and the Kremlin has promised that the troops will withdraw then. Obviously, no one's going to take their word for that at face value. We'll have to just wait and see. But I think, we will see at the end on the 20th, maybe we'll start to get a sense of, is the worst going to happen or not?
Okay, and Patrick, as they like to say on the evening news in 60 seconds or less, can you tell us, before you came here talking to ordinary Russians in Moscow, did you sense any appetite for Putin making another land grab in Ukraine, or are people just going about their business and not paying much attention to this?
Now, this is the other really, really strange part of this whole crisis, is that Moscow, the people in Moscow and my colleagues and friends there, were probably among the last to kind of wake up to what was going on. There simply wasn't that in the media in Russia, especially up until the last week or so, there's really not been a great deal of talk about Ukraine. And there certainly, I don't think, has been a desire among ordinary Russians, a demand that, there should be a major attack on Ukraine. And certainly, frankly, just no one was talking about it. And so, now I think this is a key thing as well. When people talk about whether there'll be a climb down for Putin, in Russia, people don't think he ever climbed up, because in their view, this has been provoked by Western media and by the US making these claims. And so it's one of these very surreal things where you have a completely different reality over in Russia right now when they're looking at this crisis.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to go, let's go to the audience, and I'm also going to ask Olga Tokaruk for a quick comment, but I think we have a question right here in the audience. I'll give you the microphone. There we go. If you could introduce yourself, thanks.
John Schmorhan, I'm a businessman here in Ukraine, Franklin Covey Education, Ukraine, as a matter of fact. I have a question about the NATO alliance. Today I was reading news that the Senate is at loggerheads at passing a sanctions bill because I'm not sure which party are concerned about early sanctions and what kind of effect those sanctions could have on the Europeans in terms of business. What is, I guess maybe NPR or maybe ABC would be best to answer. In your opinion, I mean, how well is President Biden doing in terms of keeping this alliance together, the alliance that threatens sanctions on Russia? Can anybody answer that?
Patrick, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure, yeah, and Frank, feel free to jump in. You know, I think in terms of keeping the NATO alliance united, I think the US is being fairly successful at the moment. Especially because at the beginning, there has been quite a lot of skepticism among European countries, particularly France and Germany, that the Russian threat is as serious as the US is saying. They seem to fall much closer to the Ukrainian government perspective, which is that the Russians are trying to intimidate and we shouldn't fall for the intimidation. And, you know, we've seen Germany obviously being much more hesitant about imposing tough sanctions compared to the US and the UK, which are kind of much more aggressive on this. I think the sanctions that are being discussed in the US, there's been this big debate between those who think you basically should sanction Russia now and those who think that you should use it as a deterrent. And it's definitely not a good sign for the Biden administration that things are deadlocked right now. It obviously sends the wrong message to Putin. I think in terms of whether that means in the future, I think ultimately though, if there was the worst to happen, I think probably the facts in Washington would change pretty rapidly. But no, certainly that doesn't send a very good sign. I think with the diplomacy we saw this week, there was a lot of criticism of President Macron from France for going as though he was undermining the unity of the Western message. But actually, our best understanding from talking with French officials and with other Western officials is that it was pretty coordinated. And essentially, you've got Macron bringing more of a carrot, while the US and the UK continue to try to brandish a really big club.
I think if there were to be an invasion, which would be an awful thing, I think that you would see, as Patrick said, sanctions go through extremely quickly in the United States. I think as somebody who spends a little bit of time in Brussels covering NATO, they look at 2014 and they say, Vladimir Putin, I mean, some people privately will even say, save NATO. NATO has been in a rolling identity crisis since 1989, 1992, and the Russian aggression gets back to the whole, reason that NATO exists and why it was formed. So I also think that an interesting thing about, were there to be an invasion, it would lead to exactly the opposite of what Mr. Putin says he wants, because it would bring in more troops more closely and people would be more likely to close ranks. Right now, one thing that is interesting is that while we were talking, and earlier Michael was asking about the military material that's coming in from the United States and to some degree from Great Britain, there are many NATO nations who are not sending anything here, which is quite interesting as well. So I think it'd be interesting to see where we are in a couple of weeks, but an invasion certainly would actually, I think, really tighten up NATO.
Yeah, I think Germany is sending helmets and Canada is sending flak jackets, although they are training troops in the west of Ukraine. In the audience, we have Olga Tokaruk, Kiev correspondent for L'agencia EFE, and a fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Olga, you wrote a fascinating column in the Washington Post recently entitled, "My Generation of Ukrainians Has Fought Hard for Democracy. We Stand Ready Once Again." Tell us a little bit about your feelings on that one.
Yeah, well, it's very hard, to try to retell what I wrote because that's something that I thought and processed, and it was published, and I kind of expressed myself. So I just recommend, if someone hasn't read it yet, please go and read it. Basically, this opinion was expressed today here, and it really resonates me as a journalist, with me as a journalist. I think that Ukrainian voice is often missing from this debate, and that's what my goal as a journalist has been not just now, but even in the previous years, and actually since Euromaidan, to try to make this voice heard globally more loudly. So I'm using social media for that, like I'm using Twitter for that, and also I'm happy that kind of what I say and what I tweet and what I think is getting some like appreciation, not just now, but like even before, and I get like requests to write, to comment from various international media. And when Washington Post reached out to me, of course, like it was an honor, and of course I was like very kind of, I had this imposter syndrome, like, oh my God, what am I going to write, and like, will they like it or not? So with some delay, but I submitted this opinion piece. And actually, you know, when I was thinking, what should I write? Like I had this idea when I was having like my evening walk in my neighborhood, in one of, you know, residential areas of Kyiv, where probably half of Kyiv lives, so not very like lonely walk, but still. So I was just, you know, walking, and I was thinking, okay, should I tell my personal story, because it somehow is very connected to the history of independent Ukraine. When I was 6, in 1991, my parents took me to the polling station at a referendum in Chernivtsi region where I lived back then. And I remember back then, like we were going to this referendum, and I knew my parents would be going for would be voting for independence, and I was so proud. It really filled me with pride. And I had this feeling that I didn't understand what independent Ukraine meant, like at 6, what can you understand? But I sensed that this was something extremely important for my parents, and they were proud to vote to support Ukrainian independence. And then like we all were happy that 92% of Ukrainians also shared this feeling and they voted for independence. And then when I was a student here in Kyiv studying journalism, when I was 19, it was 2004, and presidential elections were the second round of the presidential elections between Yushchenko and Yanukovych were to take place. I decided to go as a volunteer, as an observer, to Luhansk region, to a polling station in Luhansk region. And I remember it was me and my 2 other friends, like girlfriends. We were 19 years old. They look more or less like me, like, you know, very skinny, short girls. So we showed up to this office, and where they were like registering volunteers to go as observers. And they asked, like, where do you want to go? Which region? And we were like, okay, where nobody wants to go, we will go there. And they said, well, Luhansk, no one wants to go there. And we're like, okay, let's go to Luhansk. And actually our bus like was the emptiest one, because the buses were departing at the same time. And our bus, like, I don't know, maybe there were just 25 people, because I think like 2 buses were going to Kharkiv, and like 2 buses were going to Zaporizhia. So other regions of Eastern Ukraine, like people were willing to go there, but very few were willing to go to Luhansk. And actually it was pretty scary then, because it turned out that we were not allowed to work normally on those polling stations. And actually I was myself kicked out of the polling station by the commission that said like they registered some, that I violated some protocols. So they just made up this excuse, and they just kicked me out 2 hours before the voting closed, because then like when they kicked out independent observers, they could like, just rig the elections and, you know, do all the violations of the counting, everything they could. And some of the people actually in our team had it worse than me, because they were taken to the forest, and some like shots from pneumatic weapons were fired next to their heads. So it was really scary back then. So there was a reason why people didn't want to go to Luhansk and Donetsk. So it wasn't just, and you know, for me at 19 years old, I remember I was like crying then, because I was like, okay, I'm trying to somehow like do something to have an impact, but I felt like this force that was against us, this force that was like aimed to violate the elections and, you know, just to rig. It was so much stronger. And then in the night we were traveling back to Kyiv after the second round of elections, and we were discussing on the bus like what is going to happen, what will expect us in Kyiv. And then at 9 o'clock the electoral committee announced that Yanukovych won, and suddenly like hundreds of people started gathering in Maidan Square, and the Orange Revolution began. So, you know, and I was there again as a volunteer distributing leaflets with latest news to the people in trade union building and in the European Square. So, like, I just spent like three weeks there with those people. And then again, fast forward 10 years, almost 10 years, 2013. I returned to Ukraine after spending several years abroad, like doing my master's at Bologna University in Italy. I returned in the summer, and and I was hopeful somehow. Okay, Yanukovych was in power, but he's going to sign the association agreement with the EU, and the country will change. Somehow, we'll be moving closer to Europe. And then Yanukovych says, like, I'm not going to sign it. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Olga, people can read your column online.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just for running a long time. Could you just bring us briefly to today and how you feel what's going on right now? How's it different in a minute or less, if you can?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, yeah, for going into such details. So yeah, just like fast forward to today, like I've been there, like again, during the Revolution of Dignity, and what was amazing was this feeling of unity and of resilience, even in the like hardest, the most terrible last days of Maidan when protesters were shot. And I think like something I'm feeling now, and I think a lot of Ukrainians feel that now, that somehow again we are facing this threat, and it's even like an existential threat. It's higher, it's bigger than it was in 2014. But again, it's the resilience, and like this feeling of unity is something that explains why Ukrainians are not panicking, why Ukrainians are not afraid in a way. And I think like this experience of revolutions, of war, it made us appreciate what we have. It made us appreciate independence and democracy, and also it just makes us more united.
Thank you very, very much. Sure.
We forgot about one very important moment in recent Ukrainian history. 2014, in the beginning of March, all Ukraine was watching on TV how Russian parliament was voting to allow Russian army to fight abroad. That was the moment of real fear. And I was in the village, actually at the house of my friends, and my friends were crying because they understood that this was the end and the end of any kind of positive relationship and hopeful future relationship with Russia. This was the beginning of the future war. And since then, I think after this shock, the shock of today's escalation has smaller impact.
Interesting. We have about 10 minutes left. Let's go to as many questions as we can. We have one online from Steve Thomas. I'll basically summarize it, but it sounds like to him, I've heard this before, the West has very few cards to play. As we mentioned earlier, Russia is already sanctioned to the hilt. They've also hardwired Crimea to the mainland through that Kerch Strait bridge. So aren't all the cards pretty much in Mr. Putin's hands? Patrick, you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I don't agree that Russia is sanctioned to the hilt, to be honest with you. I remember the sanctions in 2014, and they were relatively mild. I mean, as we know, and they've been heavily criticized for that. And even so, it had a significant impact on the Russian economy back then. But the things they're talking about doing now are major, major sanctions that would probably devastate the Russian economy. I mean, if you stopped the Russians using dollars, that would, of course, have an enormous impact on the Russian economy. And so I think this line that Russia is somehow sanctions proof isn't really true, and is being pushed obviously by the Kremlin and has been pushed for many years. And they've spent the last half decade trying to beef up their defenses against, so basically weatherproof the Russian economy against sanctions. But there's only so much they can do because they're so integrated with the rest of the world. And so I think it's not really true when they say that. I think ultimately it would be an enormous gamble for the Kremlin to launch a major attack that provokes sanctions. It's possible that they are either misguided and believe they can survive it, or it's true, it's possible they just don't care. And of course, no one's saying that Putin's regime would necessarily fall if there were sanctions, but I don't think it's true that the West has played all its sanctions cards yet.
Okay, thank you. We have Natalia in Tbilisi with her hand up with a brief comment. Natalia, can you come on, please?
Yes, thank you. One thing that I wanted to say, just listening to this conversation, but also listening to so many conversations and so many pieces that I read, we keep talking about like if Russia invades, and we forget that Russia has already invaded. This has already happened. And Ukraine is home to Europe's only active war zone. Ukraine is home to Europe's worst humanitarian crisis. It has nearly 1 million IDPs, and all of it is happening because Russia has already invaded, and we can't let that slip out from the narrative. It's important to just remember and keep banging on about the fact that what Russia has done in Ukraine is not all right to this point. And the reason it's doing what it is doing now is exactly because it has managed to get away what it has done in recent years and, recent decades, possibly. But so I think we need that narrative shift. We need to think about the crisis as this is not new. None of it is new. The new thing is like everyone's descended on Kiev again, but this has been going on and on.
For that. We have one, maybe Olga, you can take this, from Arvind Jayaram. Is there a difference between how things are being viewed in Kiev and how they're being viewed in eastern parts of the country, say in Donetsk and Luhansk? I heard a number of people are moving towards western parts of the country out of fear.
Okay, I'm not sure I get the question because Donetsk and Luhansk are, as we know, under the control of Russia-backed militants. Yeah, so if we're talking about the government-controlled areas, I mean, I'm from Dnipro, which is a eastern/central city that before 2013 was largely viewed as being pro-Russian. And I don't think that at the moment the level of panic is different in Kyiv and in eastern Ukraine, in the government-controlled part of eastern Ukraine. From what I hear, from friends and relatives and just all the contacts I have in Kyiv and in the areas you mentioned, I don't really see any particular difference. Some people are prone to panicking. Some people are packing their, make sure that they have a bag with all the documents and those necessary things ready somewhere. There are people like that both in eastern Ukraine and in Kyiv, and at the same time, in both places, there are people who are completely resistant to that. Olga said earlier that she thinks it's because there is a sense of unity and preparedness, Ukrainians being ready to fight for democracy. I mean, I hate to counter that, but I think that for the majority of people, it's because they see what is happening as a distant political thing. I actually hear a lot of people referring to the crisis as political crisis, and they are used to kind of separating the politics that is happening somewhere and the real life. So I think for many Ukrainians, it's that's why they're not panicking. They just think of it as a political crisis.
Thank you for that. Any questions from the audience in person here? Okay. Frank, I'm trying to kind of summarize what's been coming in online. And excuse me, there's a question about the difference in the kind of threat level. We touched on this earlier between what Mr. Zelensky is saying and what the West is saying. We're hearing the Americans, for example, getting ready to evacuate their citizens. There's that airborne division, I believe, in Poland. Is that rift kind of at risk of expanding and causing some kind of damage, at least temporarily, between the West and the Zelensky administration in terms of working on this crisis together?
Well, I don't have any inside knowledge in terms of the conversations between the administration here and the administration in Washington. Obviously, he doesn't want this to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as anybody would. I think at the moment, the United States State Department is telling people not to come here, but it's not telling people to leave. It is telling? Okay. Well, I guess I think when I was looking at it, it was you should consider leaving, not the same as you should leave. I believe that consider leaving, which is not the same as get out now. And I mean, I think that is something to watch, obviously, very closely. The 82nd Airborne will be in Poland, and I think that's very interesting to see what they'll be doing. They've also been told, You're not crossing any borders into Ukraine. You are simply there to greet people if they come. It's interesting that they've moved them there. I would watch the State Department website because it's a big change from saying consider leaving. And anybody, incidentally, any Americans here who've ever read State Department travel advisories, they're incredibly, they're always telling everybody to get out when you don't need to get out. So the fact that they haven't said that yet is actually very telling. I go to every place the State Department tells me not to go, and nothing ever goes wrong. It's fine. So if they change that phraseology, yeah, that's a story. And I'll tell you, there will be people heading to the airports because I've been in countries where that's happened, and that's when the light switch changes.
Sure, thank you. One last question, and then Olga and I will attempt a quick wrap up. Excuse me, contrarians are saying, this is from Sonia Modern, contrarians are saying, why not accept the Minsk agreements? The answer is obvious to those who are familiar with the agreements, but could your panel clarify the gist of Minsk and why the solution is merely currying to the Kremlin's ultimate goal, at least vis-a-vis Donbass? I'm thinking the question here is that there's a lot of pressure on Zelensky to adhere to the part of the agreement to give some sort of autonomy to the occupied territories. Ukraine's argument is, well, everything has to be sequenced, including getting control over the border again. But I've talked to a lot of Ukrainians, and the feeling seems to be this is a booby trap, a death knell for Zelensky if he grants this autonomy, semi-autonomy to Donbass and Luhansk. Anyone want to tackle that one?
I can start quickly. Yeah. The thing with the Minsk agreements is that, well, something that everybody should understand, that Ukraine was, first of all, Ukraine was pushed into Minsk agreements at a very bad moment in Russia's war against Ukraine, when Ukraine was at its weakest. Second of all, the Minsk agreements do not actually prescribe autonomy per se. The agreement is that Donbass should get a special status, and Ukraine has been trying to offer things like the free economic zone to Donbass, which would lead potentially to flourishing of the region, and that would be a special status. And of course the Kremlin demands the autonomy for the Donbass. And there's, as you said, there is a problem with the sequence, the chronology of this. Like what happens first, the independent elections in the Donbass area, or the demilitarization of the area, and so on. But the thing is that we are talking so much about the agreements that have no future because Russia does not want this conflict to end. Russia now wants Ukraine to push Ukraine into talking directly to the militants that are Russian proxies, and some European allies of Ukraine are actually also trying to push Ukraine into that. But something that everybody needs to understand is that the militants also don't want this to end. They're living pretty good lives there. They're running the area. They don't want to get out or to have to go through elections, even if they're not real elections.
And have to go back to some small suburb in Moscow where they came from.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they don't want this to end. Russia does not want this to end. Russia wants the crisis to continue. So we keep talking about how do we go around Minsk agreements, while this is in a way a pointless conversation, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thank you. And just a couple of footpoints, I'll kind of include this in my wrap-up, is that as we speak, ceasefire violations along the front line, Donetsk and Luhansk, continues in the hundreds every day. And that leads me also to the point that everyone should remember is the humanitarian crisis is very much alive. It's not going to start whenever Putin makes a land grab, if he ever does, but millions affected, impacted. The last UN appeal for Eastern Ukraine, I think, is underfunded by about 50%. Finally, I'm often asked, as I'm sure you are, why should the world care? Well, I'm going to quote someone who we had on one of our recent panels, Janine De Giovanni, who's a war correspondent, and she said, conflict in this day and age could happen thousands of miles away on the other side of the globe, but it could end up in your doorstep overnight, whether it's migrants, whether it's big disaster to the supply chains, higher fuel prices, you will feel it very, very quickly. So it's very important, I think I'm kind of summarizing here, that the diplomacy track certainly continue. I don't think any of us think that's a waste of time. I think that as much as some people may want to criticize the Zelensky administration, I think the marks are, not too bad given the trajectory he's taken from his TV career into a wartime president. And I think behooves all of us who are commenting or writing about this crisis is that we have to be careful too. Someone said to me the other day, a CBC friend in Moscow, is that we don't want this to become a kind of chain reaction, self-fulfilling prophecy that Putin feels he really, really has to do something. Having said that, before I turn it over to Olga quickly for the Ukrainian summary, is that one of my favorite lines from this, which makes us, behooves us to watch this frame carefully, is it's very difficult for a general to march his troops up the hill and then call them back to barracks without losing face. So on that, I'll hand it over to Olga.
Дякую, Михайле. Та ми багато тем насправді обговорили. Україна справді перебуває в центрі всіх світових обговорень, і це гарний привід нагадати справді, що тут не питання, чи Путін вторгнеться, так, тому що він справді це зробив у 2014 році, і з того часу ми маємо 14 тисяч загиблих внаслідок російсько-української війни. Про це теж треба пам'ятати, тобто ми пам'ятаємо, що боротьба триває, і ми теж спостерігаємо, якою буде відповідь Заходу, тому що тут не йдеться лише про Україну, а йдеться про демократичні цінності, про ліберальні цінності. І в нас вийшов дуже гарний діалог, ми досягли порозуміння. І дякуємо усім журналістам, як українським, так і міжнародним. І також принагідно я хочу подякувати українцям за кордоном, які влаштовують регулярно акції на підтримку України і проти російської агресії. Ми справді відчуваємо підтримку, що ми пливемо в одному човні, і усім дуже дякую.
Thank you, Olga, and then also thank you to our esteemed panelists for being here, those who are here with us and online. Patrick will be sending you some Georgian medicine, which we'll be imbibing in a few moments to help you feel better. I'd like to thank our hosts for tonight, the hub here. You guys have been doing a fantastic job. It really shows, the renovation of this room, the technology, what young Ukrainians are really capable of in terms of delivering a world-class product. Thank you, esteemed audience, both online and here in Kiev. Thank you to Asconelli Wines. And then finally, Frontline Online is an international events program, again, focusing on issues that matter now, from the environment to science, through to foreign affairs, arts, culture, organized by Pranvera Smith, director and founder of the Frontline Club. One last point as a goodbye. I have to say that in the very few days I've been here is that I've been really, really impressed with how a lot of the journalists, foreign journalists, local journalists are working together. Couldn't be a more important time for that. Why? Because aside from the threats that you're regularly facing, there have been huge cuts, even before the pandemic, to the craft of journalism. And then also a lot of the folks have been battling against COVID restrictions. And in fact, a lot of journalists here who have come have been sickened by the pandemic. So now is the time to work together and to get the message out and to make sure that everyone gets the truth in an objective way. Thank you very, very much. We'll see you at our next Frontline Online panel. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to wherever you are. Bye-bye.